Hello again. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11. Chapter 10 and 11, you know, Chapter 10 kind of talks about early to mid 1800s. Here we go, 1800 to 1860. Okay, we're going to be talking about religion and reform. Another word for reform is change. Okay, so kind of what is changing throughout society and throughout America specifically. So I want us to be thinking about a very big idea. Okay, it's called the big idea. So be thinking this in your head. We'll come back to this at the end. But it says, to what extent, meaning how much, did individualism, new religious sects, abolitionism, and women's rights, as the movement was called in the 19th century, change American culture between 1820 and 1860? So how much, how great or not, or to what degree did these individualism, new religious sects, abolitionism, and women's rights change American culture between the 1820s and 1860s? So kind of think about that, and that's kind of the order we're going to go in today as well. So individualism, the ethics of the middle class. Okay, you have these philosophers slash authors slash people you might have heard of before. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Okay, we'll talk more about him in just a minute. But in 1835, individualism, Americans no longer are bound by social attachments to classes, castes, associations, and families. So basically, it's very individualistic. People are starting to become more focused on themselves and doing what they feel and they think is right. You have this idea called transcendentalism. Now, what I want you to do is think for a quick second. What is the root word to transcendentalism? Transcendental. Trans mean moving, okay? It's an intellectual movement rooted in religion in the New England colonies, okay, up in the Northeast, okay? Individuality, this self-reliance, this non-conformity were things that were very popular. Rely upon yourself to accomplish what you need to. That individuality, self-reliance, non-conformity. I'm not going to do what the rest of society does, okay? Sometimes you might hear the term, you might be a circle in a square world type thing. But Ralph Waldo Emerson was really big into this. To kind of become remade, a personal remaking of yourself, to discover the original relation with nature, as he did, and we'll show you that. So here we have a picture of representing individualism. There we can see that one figure, orange, the spiky hair, not necessarily the traditional sense. Here you kind of have this transcendentalism philosophy is God and nature and man. There we can see the tree that's shaped like a human mind. Okay. Here we have Thoreau, who said, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. To front only the essential facts of life and see if I could, not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived." So it's this idea of personal self, remaking yourself, becoming closer with nature and God. Also along with that, you have Ralph Waldo Emerson, okay, and his literary influences. Now, part of this remaking became very popular amongst people in the literary world. So you have this author by the name of Henry David Thoreau. He spent 2 years alone at this place called Walden Pond in Massachusetts. And with this individualism, transcendentalism, okay, he was searching for meaning beyond the artificiality of civilized society. What more is out there? You have Margaret Fuller, who started to advocate for the freedom of women. There you have a picture of Walden Pond. But it's this idea of self and God and thinking things through and stuff like that. Here you have some more examples. Here you have maybe some novels you've heard of or maybe even read. One of them being called The Scarlet Letter, written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Scarlet Letter is basically about a woman who is charged with adultery, and she has a child, and the challenge that experience is for a community in the 19th century. Now, remember, when I say 19th century, that means the years 1800s. You have Herman Melville, who wrote the book Moby Dick. It was a quest for a spiritual meaning in nature that's going to bring death. It's this journey of them trying to capture and kill this whale. So you have this idea of individualism. Think back to that original question that I asked you on the second slide. Here we also have rural communalism and urban popular culture. Okay, you guys are familiar with the terms popular culture, so you'll kind of have a basic understanding of what we're going to be talking about here. So you have this idea of utopias. It's the ideal communities that would allow people to live differently and realize their spiritual potential. So communities or gatherings of people that would just kind of let people live and act how they wanted to. Okay, I sometimes compare this with like the hippies of the 60s and 70s, that type of thing. There was rural moving from the country into the cities, and the changes that happened. They started to challenge the sexual norms of things, men and women, and husband and wife, male and female, those types of things. You also start to kind of get a shift in racism, whether there's more for it or against it, but this idea of racism and segregation kind of plays into it. New styles of dress and behavior. We see some of these things even today with people that are kind of free spirit, they would kind of be called today. You also have communalists, common ownership of property, socialism. So you have all these groups that are coming together, and they put all their possessions into one big container, one big pot, so to say, and then divvy them up. Oh, well, you need a new shirt, or I have 5 shirts and I only need 3, so I'll give the extras there, and that type of thing. They also kind of had some unconventional forms of marriage and family life. Once again, relating it to the hippies of the 60s and 70s. You had the Shakers that were part of this utopian group. They were very ecstatic dancers. They had this communal movement. Their theology or belief system was radical as their social thought. They had some very unique and unorthodox ideas during this time. You have the Fourierist movement, which basically had an 8-stage theory of social evolution. You had John Humphrey Noyes, who was kind of promoting perfectionism, that the humans can become perfect, but he also was kind of promoting this complex marriage where it's not necessarily between one man and one woman, and there are some changes with that. And many of these utopian ideas and the communalism and different things were really radical. They were really changing and making questions for the traditional ways of life. Now, during that time period, you also have a man by the name of Joseph Smith and a church that he starts. This church that he started had a very conservative social agendas. They didn't want to necessarily do anything too wild or extreme. And his name was Joseph Smith. In the 1820s, he claimed to have a religious experience. In the 1830s, he had created this book called the Book of Mormon, founded this book, and created a church called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were mainly back east. There was a lot of persecution. A lot of people didn't agree with them. Eventually, Brigham Young becomes the leader of this church. In the year 1846, he sends them to Utah. And this church, this religion, these leaders, it's kind of a blend of economic innovation, social conservatism, hierarchical leadership, and missionaries. But it's led to a very wealthy and expansive church throughout the world today. So here we can see in that 1820 vision that Joseph Smith had here he is being visited by God and Jesus Christ. And that's kind of the basis for his beliefs in the Book of Mormon and its coming about in the church. Here we can see Brigham Young, the leader that sent them to Utah. And then here we can kind of see that map. They started up in New York, made their way over to Missouri, kind of bounced around, and ultimately ended up in Utah. Now, part of the urban popular culture in the 1800s, the early 1800s, the life expectancy was only about 25 years. People died young, had families young, had many children because they just didn't know how long they were going to be around. So one way that they tried to make life the fullest was this thing called minstrelsy. Basically, what this is very a big example of racism. You have white actors in blackface. Okay, so you would have a white person, white man predominantly, who would paint themselves black with charcoal or other things, and they would go around and they would act very silly, they would talk funny, they would do things that were very inappropriate and rude, all in a way of making fun of African Americans, of these slaves that were here, of blacks. And John Dartmouth Rice kind of was the first one to start this, and it became known as Jim Crow. There we can see a picture of it. Post-Civil War, there's going to be things called Jim Crow laws, and it all kind of traces its way back to this time period and what was going on. In the 1850, you have a lot of immigrants. They're making a major presence in the Northeast America, Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey, those places. But especially in New York, and take New York City, for instance, there was a lot of what was called nativism. Nativism, meaning I was born here, or I am from here, or I have lived here longer than you, and so I am better than you. And that's going to lead to some frustration, some contention to all these new immigrants. So let me just give you an example. Okay, I was born and raised in Las Vegas. That's not an example, it's a real thing. I was born and raised in Las Vegas, and so let's say because I was born and raised here, I deserve to work at that location, whereas somebody who's only been in Las Vegas for 2 years shouldn't be able to work there. I should be given preference. I should be given special treatment because I was born and raised here, as opposed to somebody who came here later on. Now, we continue on with the idea of abolitionists. Okay, the root word is abolish. Okay, and that means to end or to stop. Now, you have this black social thought, uplift and race equality and rebellion, this abolitionist crusade, this idea of people going out and condemning slavery, saying slavery is wrong. What they promoted was immediate emancipation. Emancipate means to free. So immediately free all these slaves. And one of the ways they wanted to help people understand this was they wanted to elevate African Americans and others through education, through temperance meaning not drinking alcohol, and through hard work. Well, many people did not agree with this thought process of abolitionists, and so there was violence in Boston and Pittsburgh. Also, kind of during this time period, you have revolts of slaves. One of them specifically was Nat Turner. This was turned into a movie a few years ago. Basically, he was a slave in Virginia, revolted in August of 1831, killed 55 whites, men, women, and children. They killed them all, and it turned into a bad thing for everybody. But here we have, am I not a man and a brother? This is kind of the idea. People were trying to promote these. Yes, they are slaves, but are they not are they not a man or a woman? Are they not our brother or our sister as well? Trying to humanize the slaves so that more people would recognize and see, hey, this practice, this action of slavery, of forced work, that type of thing is wrong. Now, many of the abolitionists, it kind of started with a religious background. So the idea was, do you want to free the slaves? If you say no, then you're going to face eternal damnation at the hands of a just God. So they're using this idea of heaven and hell and God and Satan and religion to try to promote their cause to end slavery. You had a man by the name of William Lloyd Garrison who wrote a newspaper called The Liberator. Okay, think of the root word liberate, means to free. And in this Liberator, this newspaper, he demanded immediate emancipation. In 1833, he started an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society. So the society, of Americans against slavery. And so there's many people, like I said, many of them have a religious background, that are trying to free the slaves, educate them, allow them to reach their full potential of a man and a brother, or a woman and a sister, okay, those types of things. You also have the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, that basically said, what is the actual condition of slaves living in America? And they provided evidence to show how bad it was. They wanted these people to realize, hey, you may say slavery, oh, it's all right, they're working, but these are the conditions. These are the weather, the environment, the homes, the physical abuse. These are the things that are actually happening to these slaves. Now, we also had something called the Underground Railroad. Okay, the Underground Railroad involved Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and I'm going to give you an easy way to remember Frederick Douglass here in just a second. Harriet Tubman, though, she said, I should fight for liberty as long as my strength lasted. About 1,000 slaves were freed or moved through this Underground Railroad. Now, just to make sure we understand, the Underground Railroad was not a railroad underground. Okay, it was called a railroad because they used the terminology of a railroad: captains, stations, those types of things, and underground meaning secret, meaning people weren't supposed to know about it. Harriet Tubman was nicknamed the Moses of her people. Okay, now think back to biblical terms if you're familiar with the Bible. Moses in there freed the slaves. Harriet Tubman, same thing. Okay, you have the Fugitive Slave Law in 1793. That's going to be around for a long time and get changed. But basically, if you find a slave in the North, you have to send them back to the South. This led to many violent mob actions. People burned taverns or brothels. They vandalized African American churches, temperance halls, orphanages, all these groups that supported it. They were kind of had a mark on their back. They were being targeted for their assistance in the Underground Railroad. Here you can kind of see many of them made their way north up into Canada. Some of them made their way south into Mexico, but for the majority, there were different routes and different things. Okay, here you have Frederick Douglass. An easy way to remember him is his hair. Okay, kind of the Afro type style of hair. There weren't very many African Americans that had a major impact back in this time period that had that style of hair. So if you see the picture, it's an easy way of remembering him. Here we have Harriet Tubman. Like I said, the Moses of her people, helped free hundreds of slaves. Now, to conclude, we move on to the women's rights movement. Okay, in 1848, reformers, or people who wanted change, they demanded complete equality between men and women. Many felt that women inhabited kind of a separate sphere. Even though they were here, they were around us, they were kind of different. They were treated differently, different expectations. And so you had something called the Female Moral Reform Society in 1834 in New York City. One of their main things was to limit and stop prostitution. They said by acting or by having prostitution around, it is not allowing women to be equal. You're treating them as objects. You have Dorothea Dix, who was a woman who fought for asylums for the mentally ill, to be able to say, you know, there are people with mental health illnesses out there. We need to do something to help them, not just shove them off to the side and forget them. Women were very central in the anti-slavery movement. Okay. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. She met Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln said, "You're the woman that helped start this war," meaning the Civil War. You had married women's property laws in Mississippi, Maryland, Maine, and Massachusetts, which gave women the right to own property. You have Seneca Falls, which was a convention that they wanted to promote all men and women are created equal. So you have this big idea of the movement of abolitionists into women's rights. There's some similarities between them and how they were being treated as well. So you have all those things that play into it. Now, going back to that original question, to what extent did individualism, remember some of those authors and this idea of man and God and nature, new religious sects, you have the Quakers, sorry, not the Quakers. Who was it? Right here. The Shakers, excuse me. You have the Mormons with Joseph Smith. So new religious groups. Abolitionists, the idea of doing away with slavery and women's rights, looking at women as equal. So how did those things, to what extent did individualism, new religious sects, abolitionism, and women's rights change American culture between 1820 and 1860? What happened to facilitate that change? Think of some very specific examples. Think of how you could word this in a introductory paragraph with thesis sentence and with 3 main points. How you could then write your body paragraphs based off of what we were able to learn and go over today. So that was chapter 11, Religion and Reform, 1800 to the year 1860.